All right, everybody, welcome into the Fifth Dimension podcast. For today's show, I am joined by Jeffrey Mishlove. He has the only PhD in parapsychology, so I'm very excited about his perspective in that regard. Only one ever awarded. He's also the host of the New Thinking Aloud program on YouTube. And him and I have shared many similar guests in the past. James Tunney, Dr. Betty Kovacs, just to name a few. I think there's a few others that I'm blanking on, and if so, and you guys are watching this, I apologize. Those are just the two that come to mind. But Jeffrey, such a pleasure to be able to connect and have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Daniel. Or not, you're not Daniel, you're Evan.
Oh, it's all right. It's all right. Well, that's funny. I've actually been called Dan by people before in the past. I knew somebody who actually gave me that as a nickname once, and I thought it was interesting. So in a way, it's kind of still fitting. So Jeffrey, I would love to start just by hearing about, obviously being the only person who's ever been awarded a PhD in parapsychology gives you a very unique perspective. Now, I know there's a lot of people who study in that field and, and look into parapsychology, but obviously you have a very unique approach and perspective to that. I'd love to start just by hearing about your background and going into parapsychology, maybe how it's evolved over the years as well. I know you've been doing interviews for a very long time. You've been a psychologist for 40 years at this point, so or close to 40 years. I don't know if it's been quite 40 years, around there. And also, if maybe give a quick definition of what parapsychology is for anybody who's maybe unfamiliar with it, like what sort of differences there might be, because it seems very interrelated to transpersonal psychology. I know those fields very much intermingle often. So I feel like that could just be a good foundation point for the conversation.
Okay, Evan, to start out with, let me point out that I do have a unique doctoral diploma that says parapsychology. To my knowledge, it's the only one in the world, but there are hundreds, probably, people who have done doctoral level research in parapsychology and received doctoral diplomas for that work. Usually they say something like psychology. I think they may even say parapsychology and psychology, but I created an individual, interdisciplinary major at Berkeley. So I'm the only one who went through the program, and I designed it myself. So I view it a little differently, probably, than many other parapsychologists who see parapsychology as a branch of experimental psychology. I view parapsychology differently, but let's start with the traditional definition, which is that parapsychology is the scientific study of three things: extrasensory perception, psychokinesis, or mind over matter, and survival after death. That's the classic definition. Now, some people would say only two, just psychokinesis and extrasensory perception, because whatever evidence you have for life after death could be explained as examples of those two phenomena. So I viewed it as being, as you pointed out earlier, really closely related to what we think of as transpersonal psychology, the study of the world's great spiritual traditions, because people have been exploring psychic phenomena for thousands of years, and mostly in the context of yoga or shamanism. So I felt that it's important to include those approaches as well. And I actually did my doctoral dissertation looking at systems for training psychic abilities. So that necessarily opened me up to a wide range of both ancient and modern practices.
Wow. What was it that got you into looking at the psychic phenomenon, the mystical experience in particular? Because I do believe the popularity among mysticism has certainly grown, even in just the last few years. I'm coming across more people who are beginning to explore, consciousness, the true nature of themselves, and recognizing sort of the mystic capabilities, but, back in the 1980s, I'm sure the numbers compared to maybe even now, it's not as prominent. So what was it that actually guided you into this line of focus?
Well, I think I was gradually nudged along by a series of events. Some of them were very dramatic,
Yeah.
such as a dream I had of a great uncle of mine at the moment that he died, in which he came to me in a dream. It was such a powerful dream that I woke up from that dream crying tears of joy and simultaneously singing one of the most sacred songs in the Jewish religion in which I was raised.
Oh.
But there were many other experiences. I'd already been practicing yoga and meditation, and I had been exposed to psychedelic drugs, and I'd already been reading the literature of mysticism. Even as an undergraduate in college back in the 1960s, people were starting to take LSD at that point, and Timothy Leary had, along with Richard Alpert and Ralph Metzner, had written The Psychedelic Experience, in which they compared that to the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So, on college campuses across the country, there was already a kind of bubbling up of interest in these things, and I would say, I don't want to say swept away, but maybe a better way to put it is that back in the 1960s, which meant I was a child in the 1950s, which was a very Ozzie and Harriet kind of culture. The whole crust of conventional Midwestern American thought was just sort of blown away by the use of psychedelics for a whole generation, combining that with, honestly, the war in Vietnam and the realization that even though had grown up believing our government was only pure and good, and we wore the white hats, and the other countries that we opposed were all the evil people. Somehow Vietnam caused everybody to question that. I grew up in an era in which one of the catchphrases was "never trust anyone over 30." So all of these things, sort of pointed me in that direction. And then I began having a series of psychic dreams and a feeling I was being guided by my dreams to not only pursue a doctoral degree in parapsychology, but to pursue the career that I've had in media, which is now 50 years worth of doing interviews.
Right. Absolutely. It's that sort of the path of synchronicity in the purest sense, right? And I definitely can relate. And, even if I look back a few years ago, a lot of my own current circumstances, there would have been unpredictable in a sense, but the synchronicities ended up guiding me this way. And there's a lot to that. And, with these mystical experiences, and I think, most people report at some point in their life having a mystical experience. Now, not everybody makes that the foundation for a spiritual journey in the sense, sort of like what we're talking about, and opens up to the path of synchronicity. But it seems to me like there is a deep yearning in culture for mysticism, a deep yearning in culture for the spiritual path. And, this is something that Dr. Betty Kovacs talks about in her book, Emergence of Light, how that has persisted throughout history. So it doesn't necessarily feel unique in a sense, but I would love to get your take on what, in particular, coming from a parapsychology background where this is your area of focus, what maybe the myth that is underpinning the unconscious mind about psychic phenomenon, about the mystical experiences, what the dominant myth appears to be in our culture. And do you feel that shifting at all in the current times, or have you noticed a shift in that within the span of your own studies?
Well, I think if you look at culture as a whole, you can see two trends. One trend, let's say, goes back to the founder of modern philosophy, Socrates in ancient Greece, who said, "Know thyself."
Right.
And then the other trend is basically you got to earn a living. You got to support your family. You got to get a job. You got to pay the mortgage. You got to fit in. And so all of those things are pressures not to know yourself deeply, but rather to be successful in the rat race, which usually entails forgetting the quest to know yourself completely and getting caught up in the materialistic culture of accumulating more and more, because whoever dies with the most toys wins.
Right. Absolutely. And that is definitely the dominant theme still, in the modern day. And it's interesting because it almost feels like when you become aware of this mystical path and you become aware that rat race isn't all there is to, like, you sort of see beyond the illusions of the culture, right? You see that it is not, it's really just a game that we have chosen to participate in and play, right? And so when you can begin to see that, it's almost like what Joseph Campbell talks about as a hero's journey emerges within this spiritual path. I really feel that's, I almost sort of look back, and when I retrace my steps, I sort of recognize there was that call to something greater than the individual self, something beyond the ordinary, if you will, and stepping into this new space of awareness. So it really feels like the hero's journey is sort of an archetypal example of what the spiritual path really is and how we can actually I guess proceed, because there isn't necessarily a life map for mysticism in a way.
I think the hero's journey, as Joseph Campbell described it, and you can see it really clearly in the Star Wars movie, but not everybody is going to become a Luke Skywalker. And
Right.
I think you can have the mystical path can take many other forms besides a hero's journey. It can be very quiet. It can be contemplative. It can be, and especially for people who find themselves, as let's say my father did before he knew what had happened. He had 4 children. And, at that point, it didn't feel like he had many choices. But even then, there are opportunities for people to grow, to explore, and most importantly, to contribute to the lives of others.
Right. Absolutely. And, something that I've always tried to convey is the realness of the mystic experience, right? There is a deep knowing of the truth that lives within it, but something that's very difficult to relay oftentimes to, maybe somebody who is in a very rationalist mindset. And, that's the culture that we were talking about, the materialist game. We want direct evidence. We want to be able to prove these things. So the mysticism can be something that feels very difficult to almost empirically bring data towards, but I know that's an area of focus within parapsychology. It's being able to still kind of stick to scientific methods to study this. Do you think I could give some examples on what that sort of data would actually look like and how we can convey mysticism in a way that it might resonate with somebody who is in the sort of more rationalist mindset?
Well, I think it is important to distinguish between the mystical path and the practice of parapsychology. They're not the same. And parapsychology is useful because we apply the same scientific method as in other fields of science, and very often much more rigorously in terms of pioneering such things as double-blind research and meta-analysis of data. Parapsychologists use the experimental method and the field study method to investigate claims of the paranormal. Now, the paranormal isn't the same as the mystical. Right. The mystical is ultimately an experience of oneness, an experience perhaps of cosmic consciousness. Paranormal experiences might be knowing what's going to be in tomorrow's newspaper, or hearing messages, as I did, from a deceased relative, uh, or experiencing synchronicities. These can be part of the mystical path. They're often considered signs along the way that remind you that you are on the right path. They can also be considered by mystics as traps, as seductions to, especially in the sense that they can be ego inflationary. If you're having psychic experiences, you might make the big mistake of thinking that that makes you a very special person. So,
Right.
so there are all kinds of traps involved, but I can say this: since 1882, when the Society for Psychical Research was formed in Great Britain, there has been an effort by some of the most brilliant people in society to look at these paranormal events: extrasensory perception, precognitive dreams, mind over matter, psychic healing, claims of communication with the dead, study or claims of people who remember past lives, and to pin them down, sometimes using field study methods, very much the way a detective would try to solve a murder, sometimes putting it in the experimental laboratory and having people guess, what card is going to come up next in a deck of cards, and applying statistical analysis. There have been at this point over 1,000, well over 1,000 published scientific studies using rigorous statistical methods and double-blind conditions, demonstrating unequivocally to the what's known as Six Sigma, meaning chances that this could occur by chance alone of less than 1 in a billion.
Wow.
So the data is there, but it counters the mainstream cultural attitude that this is impossible. There's people who they call themselves skeptics, but I don't think of them as skeptics. I think the correct description is they are scoffers, and they've bought into mainstream culture materialism. And to the mainstream materialistic point of view is this can't happen. So therefore, it doesn't matter how much data you have, because it's impossible. So there's no need to even look at the data.
Right. Absolutely. Why do you think that the materialist culture is so much scoffing about the data regarding parapsychology? What sort of, does it pose a threat to the way the culture operates? What is sort of the motivation behind that? Is there not a way to implement it within the current system to bring about a greater sense of individual exploration or freedom, or is there no way that these can actually merge?
Well, I don't think that the findings of parapsychology are necessarily in contradiction to a physicalist or a materialist worldview. But something's got to give somewhere. And one way you can accommodate psychic phenomena within materialistic framework would be to change your understanding of the nature of space and time. You could say, for example, that it is common in physics that there are more than 3 dimensions of space, that there's a 4th and a 5th and a 6th dimension, and maybe even more than 1 dimension of time. There could be several dimensions of time. So even within a materialistic framework, that is possible. But then there are deeper reasons why people are typically afraid of the paranormal. I mean, look at all the horror movies that we have. Evan, when I was a college student back in the 1970s, Arthur C. Clarke came and spoke at Berkeley. And he had just published a little notice in Time magazine saying there was a popular psychic in that era, Uri Geller. And Arthur Clarke wrote a little article saying he didn't believe in the research about Uri Geller, and which meant something because he was the author of science fiction books like Childhood's End, in which psychic phenomena are written about. So I raised my hand. I said to him after his lecture, Mr. Clark, do you believe in ESP? And he gave me what I thought was the most honest and insightful answer I've ever heard. He said, no, I do not, because I don't want anybody to read my mind.
Oh, man.
And I think ultimately the people are afraid that their own inner secrets will be known to other people. And if you study Freudian psychology, Freud, incidentally, was also very interested in the paranormal, but he pointed out that we don't even want to know what's in our own mind.
Right. Right.
And that's the whole basis of Freudian psychology, and the idea that we have defense mechanisms so that we don't have to look at ourselves.
Right.
We don't want, and because of, the reason is because there's a conflict between the demands of society and who we really are. We are animals. We have urges, animal urges, but civilization requires that we control those urges. So as a result of that, when we have sexual feelings or aggressive feelings, we hide them from ourselves. That's the basis of the Freudian unconscious. And Arthur C. Clarke, if you read his biography carefully, you may discover that he had certain habits of a sexual nature that were not consistent with society's mores. So, I had a friend who once said there's a little larceny in everybody. If you think of it that way, do you want your neighbors to realize that they can read your mind telepathically? Isn't it much safer just to tell everybody it's impossible, can't work? Right. So there's that. And then on the other hand, you've got the fact that pretensions to psychic ability have always been part of mental diseases and psychosis. Right. Unfortunately, the mental hospitals are, to the extent we have them anymore, are filled with people who think of themselves as some sort of important religious personage with paranormal powers. So delusions of paranormal powers are also not uncommon and are associated with mental illness. So you got to walk a very fine balance between the rising tide of superstition on the one hand, the potential for mental illness on the other hand, and not to mention ego inflation as a problem as well. And then you've got your hardcore religious fundamentalists who would tell you psychic functioning is real, all right, but it's demonic and must be avoided for that reason. So there are all these pressures against people taking a simple, objective, scientific approach to the phenomena.
Right. Because, a lot of times people would say if they're able to get scientific data, if they're able to get proof behind something, they're going to be willing to believe it, right? Most people believe they have that open-mindedness capabilities. And I think most people say that with good intentions. But then when we present that, it challenges all those aspects like you just mentioned. I mean, it makes me think of, for the mental illness portion, I remember just recently I heard somebody say, the mystic swims in the same water that the schizophrenic drowns, right? So there's a very, there is a fine line, I guess you have to walk, but we can look at other cultures, right? For the people who demonstrate these abilities from a very young age, right? They're almost treated with reverence, or they go train under the shamans, or there's a very different outlook and recognition of psychic abilities. And for people who do have them more naturally, right? And you almost have to wonder how much of our own response to the psychic phenomena, creates a lot of the adversity, or creates some of the mental illness, or creates uh, our own running from the shadow. I think a lot of people will label what they see, their shadow, as the devil, as a way to avoid taking sort of a deeper responsibility for it. And so you're definitely right in all of these factors. um, I think it comes back to culture and what we were talking about earlier, and how maybe that's at the center. And it just makes me wonder if there is, based on the direction that we're moving, I think more people may be starting to recognize psychic abilities. And I just the other day I saw somebody advertising a spoon bending course, and I never seen anybody advertise that, but it had a great bend the spoons with the mind. And I'm like, oh wow, that's cool that's sort of just out there, and there's a great response to it. So there's definitely people engaging in it, but at the same time, the direction the culture is moving almost appears to be doubling down on the old materialist paradigm, so it's almost like we're creating a parallel culture that can, I guess, make room for and even have a reverence for these psychic abilities in the paranormal.
Well, we live in an era of cultural confusion, or you might even say cultural transition, hopefully. The question is, can we make it? You referred earlier to the indigenous cultures of a shamanistic or animistic nature, where a young child who has these abilities is often encouraged. But then you have to ask yourself, what has become of these cultures? Look at how they have been decimated. Their lands have been taken from them. They suffer high suicide rates. They're trying to warn us that we're destroying the planet, but we're not listening. We're destroying them, typically. I know here in the United States, there's a huge problem of Native American women going missing.
Right.
And so these cultures have been decimated just terribly, but it's emblematic of how we treat ourselves, how we treat that part of our own psyche. I could call it intuition. Carl Jung, the great psychologist, said that there are 4 primary functions of the human psyche: intellect, intuition, sensation, and emotion. But in our culture, sensation is highly valued. Emotion has a role in our culture. Intellect certainly does, but intuition kind of gets shoved under the carpet. It's the least emphasized part of our psyche. So to the extent that we treat indigenous people who value psychic functioning poorly, it's how we're treating ourselves.
Right. It's really just a mirror for our own inner behavior. I've often said in the past that the wars I see taking place externally, if you get to the root of conflict, it's no different than the own wars I've had with myself about, whatever it may be, right? There's often a fracture that does exist based on our cultural conditioning, and there's a deeply repressed side of ourselves that we really do need to almost heal, whether it's shame or trauma that's caused the repression, and heal that fracture that maybe it's ancestral, maybe it's what we're taught, it's what we're grown up into, it's the conditions of culture, right? So there's a deep call to really engage in a healing process and take a holistic approach, I think, right now. And I see many people doing that. And I saw yesterday somebody just post and ask the question, is this a collective awakening, or is this the collapse of civilization? And in my mind, I was kind of like, well, maybe it's both, right? I mean, it's like the mythology of the phoenix, right? You have that death that needs to take place in order to be reborn and have this transformation. And you could say that the human experience, we have countless deaths. I mean, our culture is very much predicated on the avoidance of death as a concept in general. So I don't think we're very consciously aware of when that's taking place. But to me, it feels like that's the mythology that seems to at least fit for the current times, because it's becoming so evident what is no longer serving us, in that either a metaphorical death is going to have to take place, or it's going to lead to our actual physical destruction, right? That seems to be at least what I'm picking up on and observing. And I think maybe an embracing of death is a necessary uh, way to start to really unpack a lot of this for people.
Well, you're raising a very good point, Evan. The fear of death is uh, a function of a materialistic worldview. On the other hand, even though materialism is culturally dominant in our scientific and educational establishments, most people don't adhere to it. Most people are open to the paranormal. Roughly 70% of the population reports they're having these experiences. They report that they believe in life after death. They know about near-death experiences and after-death communications. People are also aware of the fact that we are potentially on the brink of a huge disaster. We have the president of Russia these days threatening nuclear war. So that could be just devastating for people. And it seems as if, given not only the threat of nuclear war, but all of the pollution that's taking place in the air and in the water, that we're faced with a choice. We have to evolve or die.
Right. Exactly. Take that sort of next step in our own evolutionary process. And, maybe that evolution is in a form of consciousness, in a sense, and our own awareness. That's where the evolution may be taking place. And, when we look at death in particular, again, I know something that you really focus on is finding that empirical evidence in data. And when we look at death, we talk about the life after death and near-death experiences. I think sometimes maybe when people report believing in that life after death, maybe it's based from a religious teaching, but maybe there isn't a direct connection or a deeper faith in that prospect, right? I mean, if we go by the analogy of heaven and hell, if we're avoiding our own shadow and avoiding, I guess, having our own internal judgment day, then of course we're going to fear death at the end, because we're afraid God's going to burn us in hell for eternity. So even if that's the reason to fear death, it's still kind of creating the same type of response within the cultural framework, right? So is there a way to bring empirical data to and I know you recently, I believe, won an award about presenting data on this nature, about how we survive after physical death, and because I think having that data known would really allow for people to make a more conscious connection with their own mortality.
Yeah, you mentioned the Bigelow Award. I did receive the grand prize in an essay competition offered by the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies. And there were actually 29 essays that received this award. The Bigelow Institute is going to publish them all in like a 7-volume book of evidence. And it'll be quite exciting. I can tell you from my point of view, the evidence that we survive death is overwhelming. And one way to think of it is this way. If you're a materialist, you have a hard time explaining the very fact that you're conscious at all. The best that materialists can say is that consciousness must somehow, by some mysterious process that we have no idea how it really works, be the product of electrical activity in the neurons of the brain. But when you think about it, philosophers say, we don't know how, even in principle, you can go from dead matter to a conscious entity.
Right.
It seems that is known philosophically as the hard problem of consciousness. So, which is why I tend, even though I think, yes, you could twist and manipulate space and time, you're still not going to get consciousness out of it. The only real way you can have a conscious universe is, or a conscious individual, I should say, is if you have a conscious universe. If the whole universe is consciousness, if the fundamental bedrock of reality isn't particles bouncing around like billiard balls, but rather consciousness itself. So that's consistent with the religious viewpoints of the whole world, and it makes sense. So at that point, people are, when they think of the afterlife, they're going to ask themselves, well, when I die, am I just going to be like a drop of water returning to the ocean and I'll be part of this one consciousness, but I'll lose my personal identity? Or is it possible after death to maintain some sense of a boundary between the inside and the outside of me so that my own identity persists after death? And actually, there's quite a bit of empirical evidence to suggest that at least in many instances, that's a very real possibility. Not to say that everybody has the same fate when they die. That is not at all clear, but there's good evidence for reincarnation. There's an enormous body of evidence from people who have had near-death experiences, what the afterlife is like. They come back and they report what seems to certainly be the early stages of the afterlife. And we have many other areas of research. I, in my essay, point out 9 different independent areas of research that all point to the survival of human consciousness after permanent bodily death.
Right. And I think it's one of those things where maybe people get attached to, in terms of, I guess, evidence, maybe they're looking for a double blind study, they're looking for a hard materialist data, but the empirical evidence that you're mentioning, it is data. It is following a lot of these traditional methods. And I don't think people necessarily always realize that, or it's not promoted within the culture. So people are, I don't think most people are going and seeking this out. A lot of times information like this, or it's kind of synchronistic in a sense. It comes to us when we're ready to experience it and dabble in it. But it's one of those things, at some point in our lives, we are all confronted with the prospect of mortality, right? We're all going to face that, whether it's the death of a loved one. And, we're all going to experience that at some point, or we have our own near-death experience, something along those lines. And I think when we kind of put our heads in the sand to the reality of it, we even look at how we treat the dead. We immediately wheel them off and put them in a body bag and hide the body, throw them in a casket, throw them in the ground. And there's mourning that takes place, but it's not open. It's very closed off. And we're very, even in the process of dying, there isn't necessarily a reverence that we hold for, what's taking place, or an acceptance of what's taking place. Which, again, we've talked about other cultures and indigenous cultures where, they would have whole ceremonies and celebrations about death. They would really embrace, it's almost, I look at life and death as really a symbolic representation of the yin and yang, right? It's really the same, it's on the same spectrum of energy. It's just 2 opposite polarities, and they're constantly intermingled in this dance of life. Really, I was talking to, a guy he's a fantastic OBGYN practitioner. He's worked in both birth and death settings, and he asked me the question, well, what comes first, birth or death? It's like asking the chicken or the egg question, because there isn't necessarily, if you're looking at it from the linear materialist perspective, you can have the obvious, oh, of course, birth, right? But when you start looking at this larger picture and seeing the universe as its foundation in consciousness, that idea of birth and death, that idea of beginnings and endings, you start to realize even those in themselves are illusionary to, I guess, the larger picture. Where this human experience, that you can track it with those beginnings and those endings and those time markers. But when you go beyond that, you start to see that's not the foundation for the game itself, I would say.
Well, I would agree with you, Evan. I would. I think there's a part of each and every person which is eternal,
Yeah.
which is outside of time completely, which is infinite. Uh, most of us aren't in touch with that part of us. That's what mysticism is about, is to get you in touch with what you could think of as pure spirit, or you could think of it as the ground of being, but it's deeply, deeply buried within all sorts of other layers of our personality. So it's not necessarily easy to access, although some people, the great mystics, seem to have a natural gift for it.
Right. Absolutely. And that seems to be the timeless principle behind a lot of the mystic traditions. It's that recognition of the eternal spirit. And, for me, I look at my own upbringing, and, I'll share, I've had a lot of time to reflect on the concept of death in particular. And, I'm almost 27. So this was 7, 8 years ago. But when I was 19, my father passed away. But at the time, I wasn't necessarily consciously on a mystic path or really looking into, I always had a recognition that I think there's something much deeper than what we're told, but I didn't know how to explain that. I didn't have any traditions to really explore that within, right? So, um, but I was there when he passed away. He was in the ICU and he'd been there for a while, and I was there during his transition, in the room, holding his hand, telling him he's able to go. And in the moment of when you realize that death is right there within the next, I don't know, like the transition is happening. There's almost you enter into that timeless space. You really, you're almost, I had that, oh, I would say recognition at the time. It's like, oh, let's just be present with this. And I look back, there was such a feeling of overwhelming love and beauty that I can reflect on and hold gratitude for that moment, because it really opened my eyes to the eternal nature. And that death is not something that is so scary. Well, like if it was so scary, why was there such pure love and beauty within that moment, right? And it just got me asking those types of questions. And less than a year later, my older brother got married, and we always symbolized my dad as through the bald eagle. And I had never seen one before, but we were up in Alaska, and my brother was getting married, and we noticed right before the ceremony outside there was a bald eagle's nest right above where the reception was taking place, and it's like, oh wow, that's funny. We sort of had that knowing, oh, that's very symbolic of his spirit, because none of us had ever seen a bald eagle. Um, I'm not from Alaska. My brother just went to school up there, but it was like, oh wow, that happens to be right there. There's no such thing as a coincidence in that regard. And I've been able to go into the space where that direct communication exists, where I notice the synchronicities, where I'm receiving guidance from him in particular, and with his soul, spirit, whatever you want to call it. And so the recognition of his own individual eternal nature beyond his body, it's very evident, right? I've seen the direct evidence and experience within my own life. And I feel like if we were to be able to open ourselves up to the possibility of death, and maybe treat it culturally with reverence, be with the body, be with the person as they're passing away, because a lot of people just pass away by themselves in a hospital. They're not surrounded by family in certain circumstances. I think that would really shift our own internal understanding, not just on the nature of life and death, but on the nature of who we are. And I think it would maybe generate a little bit deeper purpose and meaning as we move forward, and kind of reverse a lot of the challenges that I think stem from our own lack of self understanding.
Good point.
Yeah, but that's that's just it's fascinating to be able to look back and almost reflect on that with gratitude, as opposed to, you know, the normal cultural idea of death. It's like, oh, let me avoid it, versus let me celebrate it and hold reverence for it. And do you have any thoughts about, you know, the times that I'm not somebody who likes to necessarily sit and predict the future. I think there's so much uncertainty and so much that we can't necessarily know. Um, but what are your thoughts about as we're moving forward? And, you know, I know you have so many different conversations with so many different brilliant minds, and are exploring a vast array of ideas. So I feel like you hold a really unique perspective on the type of work that's being done, uh, particularly in regards to psychic phenomena, and particularly to understanding the deeper nature of who we are. You know, when you look to the future and you look in the direction that we're all moving in, do you hold a sense of optimism? Do you feel that we're right where we need to be, and this is all part of a necessary experience for us to engage in a deeper awakening to self?
Well, I think I go through different moods,
Yeah.
Evan. Uh, Sometimes I feel that way, and sometimes when you look out at the world, it seems like, on the one hand, you know, the prospects for the human race don't look so good, especially when you consider that more than 99% of all species that ever lived on this planet are already extinct. Uh, the human race may go extinct, but then there's a transcendental perspective as well, that consciousness will persist anyway. I'd like to go back to the point you were alluding to earlier when you talked about the death of your father, and it evokes an understanding of a new area of research that was first described only a few years ago by Raymond Moody, the same person who popularized the concept of the near death experience. And this is what he calls the shared death experience. In the near death experience, people have a taste of the afterlife and then they come back to talk about it. In the
Uh-huh.
shared death experience, the person may not come back at all, but the people, the loved ones who are there at the bedside or otherwise connected with that person, such as I was with my Uncle Harry, who was thousands of miles away when he died, can follow that person into the afterlife telepathically, so to speak. And when you talked about that overwhelming sense of love, that's very commonly reported. And not just by near-death experiencers, but by loved ones who are sort of going along for the ride, at least part way, as they're people who they're close to pass over. So that's a very important area that is just beginning to be researched now. And I do think that when people understand that, it does open people up. So, you know, there's a huge literature now in that area. There may be more than 1 million people who have had the near-death experience and come back to talk about it. So it's also important, however, to know that a tiny percentage, I think less than 10%, probably closer to 5% of people who have that experience, it's not so positive. Sometimes it's even described as hellish. And there are those in the fundamentalist religious communities who say, see, there's the proof that hell exists. But there are other ways to interpret that as well. As you alluded to earlier, the idea that people who feel guilty because we have all sorts of actions and thoughts and things that we've said that are contradicted by the norms of society. So we expect we're going to be punished. And oftentimes, as you enter into the afterlife, what you're confronted with are your own expectations. And if your expectations are negative, they will rise up to haunt you.
Right, right. And that's exactly what people experience in that moment. And I actually had somebody on my podcast. It was probably almost 2 years ago at this point, but uh, uh, MK McDaniel, that was her name, and she was a near-death experiencer, and that was the type of experience that she had. And in that near-death experience, in terms of the actual timeline, she was there for years, what felt like, and having this experience and going through what she perceived as hell, and eventually came back to really, to explore that and connect with other near death experiencers and kind of talk about what you just alluded to, and that's to look at oneself and confront what's living within and have this uh, connection to the light and the beauty of life, death, and sort of this bigger picture, right? And that hell experience was actually exactly what she needed, even though it lasted what felt like years, to live a life with deeper purpose and meaning and responsibility upon returning, right? So I think sometimes even those shadows or those things that come in to haunt us, if you will, it's still, you can take on the approach that the universe is working for us to free us from our suffering in a purest sense, because we were suffering from that on an unconscious level anyways, even if that's what's coming up. So yeah, and I'm kind of in the same boat as you, to get back to what you made the point of, some days feeling optimistic, but I always do come back to that eternal nature of consciousness in a sense. And not that I don't deeply love humanity and the earth and there's so much beauty in the human experience, but I recognize there's an eternal nature to consciousness as well. And in death, that, I don't personally fear anything that's on the horizon or what's potentially happening. I think Ram Dass made a great quote about this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it too. But he said something along the lines of, I don't know if this is the age of the Aquarius or Armageddon, but regardless, my job is to open up my heart and be of service. Like it really didn't matter what was taking place outside of him and what they labeled it as, because his job and his mission kind of still stayed the same at the end of the day.
Yeah, Ram Dass was a beautiful soul, and I think there's a lot to be gained from studying his teachings and the things he said. I'm glad I had the privilege of interviewing him quite a few times. I would say another perspective on this is the work of the great psychiatrist Stanislav Grof. He wrote a book called The Cosmic Game. And you see, from the human perspective, war, pollution, oppression of every kind, these are tragedies. These are things that need to be resisted. The human beings need to rise above. But there's a cosmic perspective in which you can say it's sort of like reading a novel. You might read War and Peace, and when you finish the novel, you can say it was a great book, no matter what happened in it, and that we can sort of step out of our limited ego-bound perspective and see things from a more cosmic perspective, where pain and suffering takes on a different meaning.
Right, absolutely. And I think Ram Dass talked about in particular in that same light, where even if we attempt to approach the pain and the suffering, let's say, of the world, if we are in pain and suffering ourselves, we're only going to add on to that pain and suffering instead of alleviating it, right? And so there almost is a necessary, at least on an internal level and with self, to take on that cosmic game approach and to go in with a holistic mindset and really develop this type of mentality, because that is what can actually heal us and not compound upon the fear. And I think there's a lot of people who are trying to do good in this world, and their intentions are wonderful and based in empathy, in compassion, right? But in certain areas, in certain different movements or whatever it may be, there's certain levels of fear. It's still ingrained, and one could make the argument is this just compounding more of the suffering? Is this compounding more fear? And, it's how do we take that heart-centered approach? And I look at the word compassion. I don't remember who originally made this point to me, but they even said that word itself, calm, to be with, and then passion is suffering. So if we're going to be compassionate and be with suffering, it's a very fine line that we have to internally walk to really show up and make a difference. And I'd say that adds a level of certain responsibility and how we navigate what's going on today.
It sometimes is tricky. I think I agree with everything you've said, but I also realize that when you're with a person who's suffering, the last thing they want to hear is like, get off of it, see things from a more cosmic perspective, you'll feel
Right.
better. That's not going to be very helpful to them.
Right. Exactly. And I think to be with suffering is to be not attempting to alleviate it, but just to open your heart with love and, and compassion, to use that word again. And open your heart to that and have a deep level of empathy and to be one with them in their suffering. I think that's the true meaning of compassion, because the cosmic approach, it's one of those things. If I can sit here and talk about it all I want, but and use wonderful artistic expression and poetry and all these different ways where you can invoke it within people, certainly, but at the same time, it's still an inner experience. And it's like that idea of enlightenment. Once you speak of it, you really kind of lose the essence of it. So you can't necessarily just maybe there's a time and place. I think if you're in your heart, it'll let you know when that time and place is to say that. But it's really about the cosmic experience is the inner experience, and people, as long as you keep your heart open to others, it gives them the opportunity to step into that when they're ready. And I don't think we can put even a timeline if we're looking at the collective experience, of a collective cosmic experience, when we sort of play in that realm altogether. I'm not sure we can place a date on that, as much as I would like to, experience that type of what a cosmic collective culture. I don't, not that it's unrealistic, but it's not something that can be forecasted in a linear sense.
Well, maybe in your next lifetime, you'll be born on another planet where things have evolved further.
Right, exactly. Put the desire in my heart, and kind of like how people, I guess that's their underlying intention, or what's underneath the surface. And when they die, if it's the shadow and they see the shadow, if that's underneath the surface, then that's what we're born into next. That would be fine by me. I would love that. So, Jeffrey, we're at about an hour. And so I wanted to just ask, sort of as a wrap-up question, if you have any particular projects or things that you're working on or ideas that you would like to share, or final thoughts. I know final thoughts is such a loaded question, and who knows where that, that comes. But what you sort of feel compelled to share with the listeners, and where they can, in particular, go and find more of your work and find your show, and where you feel called to send them.
Well, Evan, it's been a pleasure to be with you. You have shared a lot of deep wisdom on this podcast yourself. So I'm sure that your viewers and listeners find wisdom in hanging out here with you. For people who are interested in my work more, it's newthinkingaloud.com. That's the URL of our YouTube channel. It's all one word, New Thinking Aloud, and it's ALLOWED, not ALOUD. We're about to publish a magazine. Now, I've been doing these interviews for 50 years. We've had the YouTube channel for 7 years. And next year, we'll be launching the New Thinking Aloud magazine. So that'll be a very exciting new step, and also a series of anthologies of books.
Oh, fantastic.
On the New Thinking Aloud interviews will be coming out next year. So for people who are your viewers and listeners who want to know about that, there'll be a lot of new developments in the coming year.
Oh, fantastic! I'm excited for that myself, and I can attest to your body of work, and I greatly appreciate you take a very open minded and heart centered approach with all the subjects that you go into, and I greatly enjoy all the conversations. So, and I can definitely attest and encourage my listeners to head on over there, and I'll put all of that in the episode show notes, so it's very easy to find. They don't even just scroll on down right there, one click away. Um, but it was a pleasure to be able to connect, Jeffrey, and I'm excited about the work that you're doing, and I'm sure we'll share many similar guests in the future, and I'd love to collaborate again in when the time comes. So it's really been a pleasure to be able to connect.
Thank you, Evan. It's been a pleasure being with you.
Absolutely, and thank you to all the listeners for tuning in, and we shall see you on the next episode.